last time we had been talking about motivation. We transitioned into specifically looking at hunger and weight regulation. And we had talked about all the biological aspects of hunger. So what's going on internally, which chemicals are involved, what processes are going on. So now we're going to actually get into the psychological side of things. What psychological aspects are contributing to hunger and weight regulation and all of that? So the first thing we want to talk about is the idea that we're still seeing some learned behaviors here because eating is positively reinforced, specifically by the good tastes. And so it's a little bit of a review. Positive means that we're adding something. Reinforcement meaning that it's making us do the behavior more. So positive reinforcement in this case means that you are receiving food and it's good food, so you're more likely to eat more of it because it was good to eat it. Whereas we also have negative reinforcement here because for the negative aspect, we are removing something and the reinforcement is still making you more likely to do that behavior again, that behavior being eating. So you're negatively reinforcing eating because eating reduces hunger. So you are removing, or the negative side of it, you are removing that feeling of hunger, which makes you more likely to eat in the future. So these are two reasons why eating becomes reinforced. It becomes something that we want to do more. And it also ends up tied in with things like expectations. So we have expectations that eating will be pleasurable from our positive reinforcement in the past, and that it's going to reduce our hunger, that it's also been negatively reinforced in the past, and this serves to stimulate eating. It makes us more likely to eat because we know what comes from eating. But it also gets more complex. Our individual beliefs and memories and attitudes, our personal experiences, and then we'll get also into cultural experiences. All of that can affect how and what and when we eat. So the first of these is going to be sort of a cultural and societal standard. And this is sort of external pressures for thinness, which then get turned into internal pressures for thinness. But so the big part here that's driving this is that we have this cultural standard of beauty. And different cultures will have different standards, but for the most part, our standard for beauty would be, say, models or people that we see in the media who are held up as beautiful individuals. And so a lot of this, when the textbook talks about it, when people research psychological pressures and eating disorders, they tend to focus on women because that's where you end up seeing sort of the largest effects. But I want you to keep in mind that this isn't a female-only problem. There are also standards, unattainable standards for beauty in men as well. They're just not necessarily as clean cut or as well researched. But it's not just seen in women. And we also have this issue more for women, and we'll talk about it in just a second how it differs for men. But for women, we have this overestimation of how thin you need to be in order to be attractive. And so I'm going to look at a diagram of an experiment that was conducted to evaluate sort of personal views of yourself and how others view yourself, but also how you think culture and society should view you. So we'll walk through how this works. And so we'll look at the females at the top first. And this is just a weight line of somebody who is underweight to overweight on an arbitrary scale of 2 to 6. And what the researchers did was they surveyed women and asked, how thin would you need to be ideal? Like what is the ideal thinness in society? So we have this first rating here. So what do you think the ideal body weight is for a woman in today's society? They also asked, what do you think is the preference of the opposite sex? So what do you think men are looking for in a woman? Then they also went and asked men what they prefer. on body weight. So what's the BMI that is preferred in their sampling of men? And then they asked the women from the first two questions what they would rate themselves on that scale. And so if we look at this here, a woman's self-image tends to be pretty high. So they high in this case is a bad thing, where they think that they are heavier than they would be. They also then rate, for men, their preference is somewhere in the middle of all of the other scores that we are provided with here. What women thought that men preferred, and then what women think society as a whole prefers, ended up being very, very low on this scale. So these are both well below what the actual preference is, and all of those are well below what the woman thinks she is. And a lot of these studies will also evaluate how men would view a particular individual, which usually falls closer in this range here. But we end up with our summaries at the bottom, where women overestimate how thin they need to be. And that's what these scores are telling us, where they think that society wants them to be thinner, and they think that men want them to be thinner, but the actual preference tends to be a lot less thin than what they think is ideal. And so this skewed way of thinking, especially mixed together with their poor self-image, can lead to a lot of eating disorders and problems where people will say overwork out or undereat or experience anorexia or something like that, to try and go from this inflated self-image down to this overestimated ideal image that they can never quite attain. So this is a whole system set up to cause lots of problems. And now, like I said on the previous slide, this isn't just something that happens with women. There is also a similar problem with men. And so we have our same scale down here, a body weight, body mass scale from 2 to 5, some arbitrary series of numbers. And we look at here, so what women would prefer, what men thought women preferred, men's self-image, and an ideal man's image for society. And in this case, we're not so much looking at sort of thin to fat. In this case, they're also including this image here, which is how muscled you should be. And so men end up overestimating how bulky they need to be. The interesting part here that I always like to point out is that men's self-image tends to bias towards what they think people want. So what they think is preferred by women, what men see themselves as, and what men think the ideal should be, all fall in this range here of overly fit. And then there's the actual preference from women, which is quite a bit less overly bulky, more on the slender side. But there are tons of studies, lots of research that's looked into this, and there always seems to be some discrepancy between what you assume the other what the other sex wants, or what society is looking for, or any of that. There's always this discrepancy between what they actually want and what you think they want, and how you evaluate yourself. And it all gets very complex, and again, leads to problems of self-image, and a lot of times insecurities, low self-esteem, and all sorts of other problems. So this is a complex issue that we could spend tons of time here, but we have an entire chapter to finish, so we're going to move on. So the next part of that, so after we have that pressures for thinness, we also have what's called the objectification theory. And this is something that is especially common in Western cultures, and it teaches women to view their bodies the same way that others would. View your body as an object, something that could be objectified. And the problem is, if you're considering your own self-image only through the lens of how other people see you, then you run into this issue where you're never going to feel good enough for others to be viewing you. And so you end up with this really hurtful internalized message of you can never be too thin. And again, you start seeing this happen at surprisingly young ages. So even, say, preteens are starting to have this mindset. And it causes lifelong struggles with weight and food and eating. Another interesting thing to note, though, is that while current society seems to favor irrationally thin individuals or crazy buff guys, most of Western history would have favored a more full-figured individual. Even if you go back to, say, ancient Greece or Rome, there was a lot of artwork depicting people who were fat, who had rolls on their bodies, because the ability to be fat meant that you were wealthy. You could afford to overeat. And so having that full figure was actually a desirable thing because you were showing off how well off you were. So these cultural standards and societal views tend to be pretty flexible, though right now we're sitting at that overarching drive for thinness or muscularness. Okay, so we're going to step back just a little bit from the preaching of talking about society pressures for thinness and everything, and we're going to talk a little bit more about a little bit of the biological, but getting into environmental influences and then getting into culture. And so these are going to be some of the things that affect how we eat and what we eat and when we eat. And so we talked about our biological stimuli, our things going on inside the body, changing levels of neurotransmitters or whatever. That was fine. When we're looking at the difference between being sort of overweight versus underweight, our external biological stimuli, things like being fed too much or being fed too little at any given meal, just, once in a while, if you have too much or too little to eat, it's not going to instantly make you overweight. Having a high calorie density meal, something that has lots of calories in it. Maybe you go out to a fast food place and you have a really greasy meal versus a low caloric density meal. You go and have a salad. Any one event is not going to immediately change whether you're fat or thin. So these biological type stimuli don't really matter that much. But what we are very sensitive to are changes in our environmental stimuli. And these tend to be things that will be sort of longer lasting, at least sometimes. So the first of these is something like portion size. How much food do you put on your plate when you serve yourself? Or if you eat with, say, your husband or wife, if your husband always serves dinner, if he puts more food on the plate than what you actually need, then maybe you're going to eat more. So your portion sizes are too large, and if that happens consistently, you might eat more than you need to maintain your basal metabolism, and you could end up more overweight. Things like the number of people present during a meal. If you eat alone, you tend to just eat for the utility of eating. You need a meal, so you're going to have a meal. But if you're eating dinner with your extended family, maybe it's Easter coming up, though perhaps not this Easter. Remember, Easter's in the past. You could have large groups of people together to sit down at a meal, and because there's so many of you, and it's not just the food now, it's the conversation, it's the environment, you're going to eat more than you would on your own. And all of these things can start influencing sort of what you're eating and how much you're eating. And so we can break down some of these environmental stimuli. One of the easiest ones that you can think of is the food availability. And this is a massive influencer of your eating habits, is what do you have available to you? So in places where there's food scarcity, if you're coming from a country that doesn't have access to lots of types of food, or maybe you're trying to grocery shop now and you can't find most of the foods that you would like to eat, you are limited in what you are able to eat what you have available to you is reduced, and so you can limit your consumption because you don't have much there to eat. We'll also get into variety on the next slide, but people like to eat different things. They like to have a bunch of options, and if you don't have those varieties, you might reduce how much food you eat because it's boring. In a lot of cultures now, we're starting to see this abundance of low-cost foods, especially when we have fast foods that have really high calorie densities. That ends up contributing to this widespread obesity because it's easy and it's cheap and they're everywhere. So you have wide availability to foods that aren't necessarily great for you, but people are going to eat it because it's there. And then, as hinted at, we can talk about the taste of our food, the variety of food that's available to us, and again, serving size, and these can all influence how we're eating. So good tasting food is going to encourage you to eat more. If you have, say, your mom's favorite meal, the best thing that she cooks, one serving might be enough to fill you, but it's so good that you have to go back for seconds. We talked about eating the same thing over and over again. If you have a low variety in your diet, you might eat less because it's boring. And then an interesting way to think of the opposite is think about going to an all-you-can-eat buffet where there are hundreds of options of food, and maybe you're going to take just a little bit of each. And it's more food than what you would usually have, but you have to try all of it to see what it all tastes like. And so you end up eating far more than you need because, well, there was lots of options. And we already talked about how larger serving sizes mean that you eat more. But this can bring us into some cultural factors. So in some cultures, it's impolite to leave food on your plate. So for me, I was raised that you're not finished dinner until you've cleaned your plate. However, I believe it's some communities in Italy, if you don't leave food on your plate, the host assumes that they haven't given you enough food and that you're still hungry. So if you go to some restaurants, you always have to leave, say, a noodle on your plate to signify that you are completely finished, you are full, you couldn't clean your plate, you are satisfied. So those cultural factors can start influencing how much you're eating based on what you're supposed to eat. And we've already kind of hinted at this classical conditioning idea in that it makes you want to eat because you know something is going to taste good or because it's going to make you less hungry. But we also end up with this neat idea where the smell or the sight of a particular food starts to act as a cue that can trigger you being hungry. A great example of this is if you're walking across campus and you walk into Sub and you smell that bread smell that they pump out from the Subway sub there. And maybe you weren't hungry, but as soon as you smell that delicious aroma, you feel like you need to eat something. So that is a classically conditioned response where you smell something that acts as a cue, and all of a sudden your stomach starts growling. You start feeling hungry. And all of a sudden you're no better than Pavlov and his dogs, who would start drooling at the sound of a bell. Maybe your stomach starts grumbling when you smell something that would taste good. So that's how classical conditioning can play into that. And then cultural influences get their own slide, even though we've kind of referred to them on a bunch of other slides too. We've talked about cultural norms previously in this course, I believe. But what is a standard within your culture can influence when and how and what you eat. And so interestingly, some Mediterranean countries tend to eat really late. Maybe they'd start dinner at, say, 9 p.m. Or I remember my grandparents who were from Atlantic Canada, they would have dinner at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sundays because that's when proper dinner time was. I don't do either of those. I tend to eat somewhere in the middle, which is my normal, my cultural norm. But people from different places might have different rules on when they eat. And there's also cultural preferences for food. People tend to be more comforted by foods that they're familiar with. So if you're having a really bad day, then maybe you're going to make something that makes you think of home. I would always make, it's really simple, but I would make mashed potatoes because I'm usually too lazy to go through all that effort, but that was something my mom would make, and so that's my comfort food. And we also have the converse of that, where people tend to eat less or avoid foods that they aren't really sure of. So if it's not something you're familiar with, maybe it's something from a different culture, you might not feel like trying it. So all of these can play a factor on what you do and don't eat. And so we've already talked a little bit about obesity, the idea of overeating and maintaining fat on your body to the point of causing some problems. And for some rather outdated statistics from the textbook, just over half of Canadians fall into the category of either overweight or obese. And overweight being a little bit bad and obese being more bad. And it's more towards men than women, but only just barely. And we can talk about genetic influences. So your genes can influence that basal metabolism, how much energy you burn when you're not doing anything. So some people are really lucky. They have genes that give them a high metabolism. And so even if they're not exercising or working out all the time, they still have a really low body mass or low fat content because they have a high metabolism. Other people tend to bias the other way, and they'll have a low metabolism and they'll store energy as fat, even if they do exercise or work out or things like that. And just for the sake of keeping time short, I have a couple of videos throughout the lecture today. They're more interest's sake, but it's talking to people about when you're born with a genetic predisposition towards holding on to weight and becoming obese versus environmental influences on obesity as well. So that's this slide, and the next one are some YouTube videos if you are interested, but not mandatory. And then we have our environmental influences, which we just talked about, influencing sort of eating habits. And you can make that extension now where your eating habits can then in turn influence how much body fat you have. So we have that problem with inexpensive, tasty foods that have high fat levels or high carbohydrates. They're not good for you, but they taste good, and then you want them, so you eat them, but you store more fat. Causes problems. We have sort of the cultural influence of supersizing, where they ask you, would you like fries with that? Or would you like to get the next size up for just a small amount of money more? And that's an interesting one to consider because there's sort of this evaluation of the value of the meal that you're getting. And if you can have a small fries for $2, but you could have a medium fries, which is double the volume, and it only costs you 50 cents more, then you sort of feel bad about just getting the small fries because the other one is a better deal, even if you only want to eat a couple of fries. So you feel that drive to get the best value and end up with food that you didn't necessarily want, which of course causes problems. And again, there's lots of really cool research looking at these topics, but we don't have tons of time to delve into it, just so that you know it exists. And other environmental influences are decreased rates of daily activity, which are probably compounded now where we're stuck at home. So you can't go out for a walk as often. So overall trends towards less activity in our days tend to lead towards less calories being burned and then storing more fat. And then the last couple of slides on weight and hunger and motivation in that range talks just a little bit about dieting and weight loss. And this brings us into, again, sort of that psychology side of a topic that we might think is more biologically based, but it really isn't. So we talked about the biological influences. Sometimes you have genes that predispose you to sort of have a high metabolism or a low metabolism, but there are so many other factors involved. One of the problems is actually of the weight loss culture itself. And so you see ads all the time that advertise a particular diet or a particular system, and they'll tell you, like, look at this person who lost 100 pounds in 6 months. But that's just them picking sort of a best case scenario. They don't necessarily tell you, like how we'd expect for a regular scientific study, they don't tell you what was the average, what was the range of your data, how many people lost a lot versus how many people lost a little. So you don't get a really good estimate of how effective a particular system is, because they're not really encouraged to report all of their data. A diet program is trying to get more people to try their program, so they're going to show you the best case scenario, and then there's going to be fine print that says not everyone sees these results, but the scientific minded of us might want to see, out of 100 people who were on this diet, what was the average? What should we expect to see overall? So that's one of my pet peeves about dieting and ads for stuff like that. But that's a lot for a single point. We also have the issue that some people, those genetic few who have a high metabolism because of their genes, they might be able to maintain weight loss just fine. Just by eating right and exercising a moderate amount, they can do fine. Not everyone falls into this boat, but there's a lot of individual differences to consider. We can also consider what's motivating someone to lose weight. Why are they doing it? Because we just talked about, say, the motivation from societal pressures, being pushed because you see ads that are full of overly thin people and you want to look like that. Those are some motivations. They're not necessarily healthy motivations, but they do exist in a lot of people. People can also be motivated by health concerns. Maybe somebody in your family has a heart attack, and then you decide you want to take better care of yourself so you don't have that happen to you in the future. There's also psychological and social concerns. That's more along the lines of, I'm concerned of how I look or how others are viewing me. Maybe you want to look good because it matters for your job. Maybe you're a fitness instructor, and so you would like to look like you're fit. All sorts of things to consider. And then we have to keep in mind that sometimes these motivations can be taken to an extreme, and it can turn into eating disorders or some kind of psychological problems. So there's, again, lots of factors going on here. And so when we're talking about our psychological applications, all the stuff that we've talked about so far, how can we apply this to dieting and weight loss? We should stress how important our self-image is. So we have to keep in mind that, when we're looking in the mirror and we're evaluating ourselves, we tend to have that unconscious bias where women might see themselves as more overweight than they really are, or men might see themselves as more or less bulky than they really are. And then there's also sort of that perception of how are others viewing you, and having negative self-esteem makes you assume others view you as less than you are. So some interesting stuff there. We should also be aware of that response that we can have to food, where that gut instinct when you smell something really good is that you feel hungry. Maybe you could reason with yourself and go, no, I don't need to go to Subway. I have a meal at home and I'll eat it when it is mealtime. I'm not going to eat early from a fast food source just because it made me feel hungry. And we keep in mind, again, it's not just a matter of willpower. So it's not just that people who succeed at diets have strong willpower and people who fail at diets don't have it. There's also other stuff going on. We have the biological level of things. We have the psychological level of things. We have to keep in mind where all of these stimuli are coming from and how we're interpreting it. And we're not necessarily able to control all of our responses. So keep all of that in mind.